Let us check out this
It's
horrors
1980.
from an FBI database. This is by Farrell McGuire. Never heard
New
of him.
President Ronald Reagan has just survived an attempt on his life. An emerging
Okay.
virus called HIV is becoming a growing concern, and workers at a wastewater treatment plant in Richmond, Virginia have just made a grisly discovery. An employee had been walking along the settling basin, a structure used to separate water from solid material, when he saw what appeared to be the body of a young woman.
Oh,
The police were called and their remains were recovered.
Uh-oh.
The woman was young, short, and slim, and had a tattoo on her arm reading, DR. A forensic analysis revealed that she had undergone a hysterectomy at some point in her life, which might point to pregnancy complications, treatment for ovarian cancer, or even darker, routine treatment at a psychiatric hospital in 20th century America. The hysterectomy didn't have anything to do with her death, however. That came about because of a bullet wound to the head.
Oh.
Other than the surface level information, nothing else could
Well,
be gathered
she took
to
a
tell this
bullet
young woman's
wound to the
story.
head and then dumped
So,
in
using
the
1981
fucking...
technology, the police made a crude clay model of her head, depicting what she might have looked like before she passed to see if the public might be able to identify her. But nobody ever came forward. With no leads and nowhere to look, the police just stopped investigating. Life would go on the same as it did before.
Uh-oh.
Nobody would ever grieve this woman. Her story would never be told and justice would never be served. She would never even have a name, only ever being referred to as the Richmond Jane Doe.
That was in the 80s.
And unfortunately, she's not a unique case. Currently, in the United States of America, there are more than 10,000 unidentified bodies.
Correct.
The idea of just coming across a body that never gets identified has to be one of the most disturbing concepts I can think of.
We also have a bunch of
In
serial
fiction, there's a
killers
common
running
trope of an
around
angry
too,
spirit
and
haunting a
murderers
place,
that
desperately
still
trying to
haven't
get
gotten
somebody
caught.
to tell their story. And these movies and books usually end with a tragic tale of their death finally being told, putting the ghosts at peace and allowing them to move on.
Oh, in a sense,
Horror
yeah.
usually ends up being scarier than reality in most cases, but in this particular realm, reality is much darker than fiction. In real life, the body and the person that occupied it just stays lost forever. Their only memorials are scattered disconnected case files in different law enforcement agencies. In some cases, loved ones are desperately trying to get answers, unaware that the person they're searching for has already been found. But even darker than that, a lot of these people go unidentified because they've just been forgotten about, and the world callously moves on without them. When the Richmond Jane Doe briefly held the attention of law enforcement agencies in the early 1980s,
there's also people who
criminal
fake their own deaths
investigations
and
mainly
then
relied
are
on
all like,
traditional
"Oh, hey, I'm
tangible
back."
evidence,
Like what?
like eyewitness accounts, fingerprints, and ballistics
I've
analysis.
been a couple times.
But a new movement had been gaining momentum.
Or missing
Instead of just
people
looking
just
for
pop
measurable
up.
evidence in
They're just
individual
like, "Oh
cases,
yeah, I went for a
criminal
walk and then
profiling
I
had police identifying
couldn't
characteristics
remember
of
where I
crimes
was
that could
going,
point to
so
the
I
perpetrator's
just ended up
psychology in
here."
some way.
What?
This had law enforcement investigating previously overlooked
And then
aspects
you
of
can't
crimes,
find the people
like
who
the
just
degree
go
of control
missing.
used by the
Like
offender,
they just vanish
the
out of thin
escalation
air.
of
It's like
emotion
they're
in the
gone.
act, and how organized or
They
messy
just
the
be
crime
gone.
scene was. Identifying these characteristics allowed police to not just categorize the sort of suspect they were looking for, but to also link different crimes together in a way they weren't previously able to using only traditional investigative techniques. But there was a problem blocking that last part from coming to fruition. Back in the early 1980s, law enforcement agencies were more or less working in isolation from one another. They all had their own specific procedures
who had a
paperwork and local
fucking
files,
serial
and there
killer
usually
call
weren't any
in?
protocols in place to share that information amongst
Their
themselves.
fucking radio
This
show?
caused something called linkage blindness. If a serial offender committed a crime with striking signature characteristics and then went over to another county and did the same crime with the same signatures, those two cases wouldn't get linked together because the departments investigating them would be working in isolation. Even if they did share information, the documentation would be different and a lot of commonalities wouldn't be noticed because of that. This is what VICAP was intended to solve. In 1983, Los Angeles homicide detective Pierce Brooks would testify before Congress to advocate a radical new idea: a computerized database to track unsolved crimes that could be accessed by any law enforcement agency in the country. This database would be set up in such a way that the seemingly minute details of different crimes could be linked together, helping investigators make connections they wouldn't have previously been able to make. Brooks' idea was received
Wouldn't that kind of be like AI, right? Trying to use AI to find out the discrepancies
The database would be
and
built
shit?
and stored at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia in 1985. And while it may have started out with the thousands of different law enforcement agencies around the country having to mail in handwritten forms that would be digitized by hand in Quantico, the procedures would advance over time as the world became more
basically
connected.
you would have
First through fax machines, and then through an interesting new technology called
translators
the Internet.
to
In the 2000s,
type
the
it in,
FBI would launch
basically.
VICAP Web, a fully internet-based
Administrative
version of the
workers.
database that could be instantly accessed and browsed by law enforcement agencies. While VICAP Web was and is only able to be accessed by verified law enforcement users, the FBI would also create a much more limited but publicly accessible version of the database, which you can browse through a website hosted by the FBI. When we talk about things that are scary on this channel, there's usually two categories.
Yeah, you can even search
Fictional
up
horror
like
tends to be very dramatic and
the
solely relies on artistic elements like aesthetics and
missing
storytelling to create fear.
you can search up the
It's by
missing
design
persons
calculated in its
list.
delivery.
You
Real
can
life
search
horror,
up
on the other hand,
the
is never calculated.
America's
It's
Most
not art
Wanted
designed to
list.
strike fear
Right?
in you,
There's
yet
still
it always
people on
does a
that
much
list.
better job of that than fiction. The FBI's VICAP site is a perfect
There's
example of
certain
that
lists
second
you can look
category.
up.
It's just a cold list of unsolved crimes presented in a manner only meant to
Correct.
convey information in an efficient way and nothing more, but it still manages to be one of the most disturbing sites I've ever seen. Here you'll find the Richmond Jane Doe, as well as many other unidentified deceased people. The visual depictions of these individuals range from actual photos to digital recreations to physical recreations to drawings to even just articles of clothing in cases where the body is in such bad shape that clothes are the only remaining identifying traits. This entry is particularly unsettling. The only lead
Because they're
investigators
trying to
have in
find
this
leads,
case is a
so
single
they
shoe.
just
The remains were in
basically
such
put
bad
up
shape that
photos
even the victim's
that
sex couldn't be
don't have
determined.
too much
Like the vast majority
too
of
much
cases
information
here,
on them
this one
that's going
remains
to be
unsolved. I find it interesting how VICAP
right,
sits beside the
too
FBI's top 10 most
graphic
wanted
for
lists on their
posts.
website, as these two pages feel like yin and yang. The top 10 most wanted are
Or,
lists of
not too
perpetrators of
much,
crime they're actively trying to catch. Or in other words, stories they're trying to put resolutions to.
evidence
VICAP
that's
is a
going to be
list of
shown.
victims of crime they're trying to
Because
identify.
they're still trying to
or rather, resolutions they're
investigate the
trying to
crime.
put stories to. The two sites feel like binary opposites. Another thing you'll notice on VICAP is how unsettling a lot of these photos look, even completely separated from their chilling contexts. These
Yeah,
reconstructions
you got the
often fall
fucking
into the
uncanny valley
with the
vibe
people
going.
they're depicting looking
Literally.
almost real but not
like
quite, leaving
literally all
anyone
these
unsettled.
pictures give me
All of
the
these
fucking
depictions look
goosebumps.
not unlike something you would see in some online horror project, but not everything creepy looking here is a reconstruction. On June 3rd, 1991, truck driver Eduardo Collin pulled into a Super 8 motel off of I-40 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He rented a room for
New
two people
Mexico?
for just one night, but the following morning, Eduardo never came to check out.
Uh-oh.
After waiting an entire day, the motel eventually sent a security guard to check on Eduardo's room on June 5th. It had been locked from the inside, and the guard had to essentially break in using a screwdriver.
Oops.
When he finally got in, there was no one to be found in the main part of the room, just scattered bottles of alcohol. The bathroom was a different story though. And there, the security guard found a woman suspended in the air, hanging from a suitcase strap tied to the shower.
Oh.
She was dead. Investigators would determine her cause of death to be hanging, which was found to be self-inflicted,
Suicide,
and
yeah.
had occurred on June 3rd, the night the room was rented. Even though she had only been deceased for 2 days, the shower had been running the entire time, and the extreme amount of moisture combined with the sweltering New Mexico heat greatly advanced the decay process, and her body was already in a state of putrefaction when she was found. She had heroin in her system, and judging by the fact police found a scale in the room, drugs may have played a part in this tragedy. Many questions hung in the air about this case, the most immediate of which being Eduardo's whereabouts. He was nowhere to be found. The license plate he had given to the hotel staff had been fraudulent. The front desk employee, who had been working the night of June 3rd, was able to give a physical description of Eduardo, which happened to fit a picture found in his room. This is a photo of the deceased woman while she was still alive. It appears to have been taken at one of those mall photo booths, and the police assumed that the other man in the photo was Eduardo. No one had seen this woman while she was still alive. She had no identifying marks on her body, and she didn't have any sort of ID on her. The only record of her ever having been alive in the first place was this eerie photo of her and this mystery man. Years would go by without any progress in this case. The effort would mainly be focused around finding Eduardo. Eventually, the police would manage to track down his immediate family, who let investigators know that Eduardo had passed away from natural causes while they were looking for him. When police asked family members if they had recognized the woman in this photo with Eduardo, they only reacted with confusion. The man in the picture was not Eduardo.
Oh.
Again, no progress would be made for an enormous amount of time, until 2021 when investigators actually managed to somehow track down the man in this photo. While his identity has never been released publicly, the police are not considering him a suspect in any possible crime. He also wasn't able to fully identify the woman, only telling police that she had come to Albuquerque from Los Angeles. that he only knew her as Becca. The initial and most common
Interesting.
theory regarding this mystery is that Becca may have been a lady of the night. Also found in the room were 5 $100 bills, an oddly large denomination of money to be carrying around with you, especially in
True.
1991. It would explain why she was with a truck driver at a motel and why she didn't have any ID. The police have also supposedly recovered
and
more
she had a
pictures
bunch
of
of
Becca while she was
drugs on her.
alive, but haven't released them publicly because of their
It must have
supposedly
been some
explosive
kind of
nature.
drug dealer.
Whether Becca was an escort or not ultimately doesn't matter. Investigators assume she was, and her case likely didn't get the attention it needed because of that.
Okay.
If Eduardo had been located before his own death years later,
Lady
this
of the
case would have
night could have
solved
been
more than 20 years
slanging,
ago.
could have been
But he wasn't.
doing all
So it
sorts
just
of
remains as
shit.
one of the many eerie entries in VICAP. If you're interested in helping on this case, I really recommend checking out the Becca Doe subreddit, which was set up with the specific purpose of investigating this case. And you can also check out the Grateful Doe subreddit, which is intended for all unidentified people cases. Believe it or not, internet sleuths are not just good for finding lost media. Grateful Doe has actually directly linked a couple unidentified people to missing persons cases, and I'm sure they would appreciate your help. One thing I find interesting on VICAP is how the visual reconstructions vary in look depending on when the case was open. Nowadays, detailed digital artistic recreations seem to be the standard, and while these sometimes can look uncanny, they really don't compare to the clay reconstructions you'll see in older cases. Some of these are genuinely nightmare fuel. They're made to resemble the victims as much as possible, but at the end of the day, they all still seem to end up looking somewhere in between life and death. I mentioned the Uncanny Valley earlier. One theory as to the origin of why the Uncanny Valley effect exists in the first place is fear of corpses. Humans may have an instinctual fear of dead bodies to keep us away from diseases that may harm us, and in my opinion, these unsettling clay models perfectly trigger that instinct.
Yeah, I mean, if you've seen medical documentation of certain surgeries,
the more uncanny the clay model looks.
you ain't gonna be
in May
fucking squeamish.
A farmer in Boone County, Indiana, was working his fields just like any other day. As he worked his way to the edge of his property near the main road, he noticed something laying in the long reeds in the distance. He had a bad feeling and decided to not approach whatever was in front of him, and instead went back home to contact the police. When law enforcement came, they walked down from the road into the reeds, and there, they found the decayed body of a young woman.
Oh shit.
She wasn't wearing any clothes other than a tank top, and didn't have any noticeable wounds on her body that could point to an immediate cause of death. Her face was so badly decomposed that she was completely unrecognizable. The only distinguishable characteristics on her body were 2 tattoos, one that said, "Mom," and another that said, "Love." Investigators guessed that she was likely between the ages of 17 and 24, but other than that, there was no way to identify this woman, and she would be entered into the system as just one more Jane Doe. Without anything to go on, police would start combing through missing persons files in the local area to see if they could find any leads, but none were found. They started investigating nearby truck stops. Maybe this was another case that began with a trucker picking up an escort. After questioning countless workers and passing out flyers to the many people passing through these truck stops though, no leads were found. After a few weeks of investigation, the case was considered to be cold, and the woman would be given a pauper's grave next to the police station, with an eerie tombstone only reading, "Unidentified female." A year later, police would reach out to a professor at Michigan State University who had been making advancements in facial reconstructions. They exhumed the victim's body, which at this point was
didn't
nothing
even
more than
put
a
like
skeleton.
Jane Doe or something.
Nevertheless,
they just
the
put
professor did his best to
female?
recreate what Jane Doe may have looked like before her untimely death.
Why did you just play the Silent Hill sound?
I looked through every entry on VICAP, and this was by far the most unsettling facial reconstruction I came across. I get that they likely didn't have much information to go on with the extremely poor condition of her head when they found her body, and they were just doing the best they could in what was at the time a still primitive field of forensic science, but I can't help but feeling a little unnerved every time I see this photo. The police would place this model in their lobby to see if anybody who passed through it may have any information, but nobody ever did. In 2018, they would use more modernized techniques to make a couple much less unsettling looking facial reconstructions, but these still didn't lead to any new developments. It would seem like the Boone County Jane Doe was just one in an endless line of unidentified corpses found in the USA who would never get their story told. But in 2020, that would change. You see, when they exhumed her body in 1993, police had luckily made sure to extract some of Jane Doe's DNA, and 27 years later, they sent it to a forensic genealogy firm for examination,
Oh,
and just
wow.
over 1 year later, a match was found. In 1992, the Shinagovsky family in Toledo, Ohio were dismayed when their youngest daughter Maggie had seemingly vanished into thin air. While alarmed, they weren't entirely panicked.
Hey, what was I
Margaret was
talking
about to
about?
turn 18, and
Missing,
all 7 of her
vanishing
older siblings
people,
had
and
left
then,
home
oh,
in a similarly
turned up,
swift manner around the same age.
passed
So
away
why wouldn't she
because,
do the
well,
same? As time went on, they
someone
heard
killed
nothing
them.
from her though. The Shinagovskys' concern grew. They found that she had taken nothing from her room, which was messy and didn't look like how someone would leave their space before moving out. Maybe she hadn't just left home to start her life. Maybe something happened to her. Her siblings would drive around looking for her, but would come up empty-handed. It's unclear whether they filed a missing persons report or not, but for the next 28 years, Maggie's family had no idea if she was off living her life somewhere or if something horrible had happened to her. But in 2020, their worst fears were realized. Margaret had met an untimely end, likely before her family even began looking for her. As tragic as this situation is, it is nice to see such stale cold cases still getting attention and even being solved almost 30 years later. Although you can't really say this one is fully solved. Police are treating Maggie's case as a homicide, and they're still looking for information that could lead them to whoever committed this horrible crime. Not every case gets solved because of cutting-edge forensic techniques. Sometimes they get solved because of ICAP. You might be wondering why the FBI decided to make a public version of this program. Well, that's because public interest has been a key part in getting these cases
Well, I
solved,
mean, yeah.
and VICAP
I
is a
mean,
great
it's
way to
easy to ask
publicize
the
these
public
mysteries.
to
Our
say
next
if
case,
they've
though,
seen
believe it or
something,
not,
because
was
maybe they
solved in
have.
no small part because of Reddit. It's June 26, 1996. Along US Route 58 in rural Virginia, the cars unrelentingly rocket by.
I mean, this is why,
Each one
right,
passing through this
cops,
liminal
right,
space without ever giving it a second
investigators use social
thought. A
media
highway
now,
is never a destination.
or well, they
it's
should
only a
be.
means to get to one. For the occupants of a certain Volkswagen bus, however, this normally transient area would be where their stories would meet an abrupt end. Greensville County Police were called out to a tree line outside the expressway, where they found a van which had crashed head-on into the trees after seemingly veering off the road. Inside it were 2 young men. They were not wearing their seatbelts. The high-speed collision had taken their lives.
Ooh.
The driver was quickly identified as 21-year-old Michael Hager from South Carolina, and police believe the crash likely occurred because he had fallen asleep while driving, as there were no drugs or alcohol in his system. The other man in the car, though, was not carrying any ID, and on top of that, his face had been severely disfigured in the crash, making visual identification next to impossible. Police contacted Hager's family to tell them the bad news, and to also ask if Michael had been traveling with a friend. They said he wasn't, and they also didn't recognize his passenger. A theory developed that this man may have been a hitchhiker that Hager had picked up somewhere along his journey, possibly because of a shared interest. The mystery man had been wearing a tie-dyed shirt when investigators found him, and they also found 2 ticket stubs for a Grateful Dead concert that had occurred 2 nights prior. Hager had not attended the concert, but he was a Grateful Dead fan. It's possible the reason he stopped to pick up a random hitchhiker was because they were both deadheads, members of a counterculture movement revolving around the Grateful Dead. Also found on the man's body was a handwritten note. It read, "To Jason, sorry we had to go. See you around. Call me. Carolyn O. and Carolyn T." At the end of the note was a phone number that was unfortunately incomplete, making it impossible for investigators to follow up on, but it did give them one important clue. This man's name might be Jason. Unfortunately, this was the extent of the leads police had to work with at the time, and the case almost immediately went cold. Yet another eerie clay mock-up would be made along with the police sketch, and investigators would ask for the public's help in identifying who this man may be, but nothing would happen for another 17 years. In 2012, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children will make a better and more modern reconstruction of Jason's likeness, and the public would once again be asked for help. A subreddit would be created called Grateful Doe, which I already mentioned. Internet sleuths here would tirelessly search social media looking for matches. Eventually in 2015, some photos greatly resembling the reconstruction would be found. They were posted by the former roommate of the man in these pictures, who said his name was Jason. Unfortunately, the roommate couldn't remember his last name, but this was still an extremely promising lead. The roommate goes on to describe Jason as a laid-back teenager who was into surfing and the Grateful Dead. He had a lot of close friends, but sometime in 1995, he would just vanish without a trace. Mainstream news would start reporting on the story, and Jason's mock-ups and pictures would be shared far and wide on pretty much every social media site. And soon enough, a breakthrough would be made. Jason's last name was Callahan, and when he had turned 18 in 1995, he decided to leave his hometown of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina to explore the country on his own. Eventually,
Oof.
he stopped contacting his mother, who had assumed that he had just started a life somewhere. He had come from a broken family, and it's not that unusual for children of divorce to estrange themselves from their parents. Unfortunately,
True.
though, this wasn't the case for Jason Callahan, as his life was put to an end before it could really even begin. Like we talked about earlier, the Grateful Doe subreddit would be used after Jason's case was solved to help out with other cases of unidentified bodies, one of them being our final case for today. In October 1995, in the sleepy
Brewster.
town of Brewster in New York State, the body of a middle-aged man would be found in the woods outside an abandoned schoolhouse.
Uh-oh.
The police would be called out to investigate and quickly found evidence that this man had put an end to his life by his own hand. He had no identification on his body,
Hanging?
but despite this, his face was still in perfect condition. You'll notice that this is the first case we've talked about today where the victim's face hasn't been disfigured in some way. This is rare. Usually a big reason why people can't be identified is because nobody knows what they might have looked like before they passed on.
Right.
Investigators would have a much easier time making an accurate reconstruction in this case. And even more than that, this man has a very recognizable face. Surely someone would be able to recognize him, right? Well,
Oh, he's
someone
going
did.
bald.
2 days prior to his body being found, a worker at a curtain shop had sold 2 expensive blankets to this man in the nearby town of New Rochelle.
Oh.
He was then seen taking the train to Brewster on the Metro North Railroad. Unfortunately though, these witnesses couldn't give any clues to this man's identity, and they were the only ones who ever came forward. Despite an extensive investigation and having a very accurate looking facial reconstruction, this John Doe has never been identified. The police have made numerous public appeals, the latest being a VICAP alert sent out in 2020, but no accurate leads have been found since the 90s. The main theory I've seen regarding this case is that this man possibly traveled from New York City to a small out-of-the-way place in a less populated area of the region to end his life, and purposely threw away his ID so he would never be identified.
Possibly.
New Rochelle is on the way from NYC to Brewster, and the man is also considered to be of Latin American descent, with New York City having the state's most significant population of Hispanic people. The idea of traveling to an out-of-the-way place to put an end to your existence with the intention of never being found is not just terrifying, it's also tragic. Everything you've ever done, every other life you've ever touched, your entire story gets boiled down and reduced to a physical thing, a corpse without a name. The VICAP site to me is not just the most chilling site the FBI has, it's probably the most unsettling site I've visited, period. Becoming unidentified is a very certain kind of terror,
Yeah.
and I can't imagine the state of mind
I
somebody
don't-
would be in to purposely choose that as their
I don't
exit.
think you've seen
It goes without saying,
catfishers.
but if you happen to recognize any of the 3 still unsolved John and Jane Does we talked about today, please make a post on the Grateful Doe subreddit. They know how to get in touch with investigators. I'll also restate something I said earlier. If you're into solving internet mysteries and looking for lost media, maybe consider joining Grateful Doe and help look for lost people as well. That's it for today, guys. Have a good night.
Alright, and there you have it. That was into some of the, missing persons databases, right, of the FBI. The open system that anybody can, search up. If you want to check out more of his videos, honestly, there you have it. He probably does a lot of, police, FBI, deep dives into certain topics. Anyways, there you have it. Farrell McGuire. Give him a like and subscribe. Yeah. Much appreciated.